Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tim. This is another Real Ideal Gear review, and today we're looking at a massive watch from Bulova. This is what I would call the Gigantor watch. This is a watch that I searched out and looked for, just a watch that was huge from a company that I trusted and just a different design overall. So I'm really pushing the limits on some of the things that I typically go after when it comes to a watch. And the biggest one really on this one is the chunkiness factor. If you haven't seen the video that I did on what is a chunky watch, check out this video and I'll let you in on just how to calculate that proportion, that ratio between the diameter and the height off the wrist. And you get what I call a chunky factor ratio. So check that out. But this watch is definitely a chunk monster. It is a super chunk. Now we're going to go through the 5 things we typically go through: size, fitment, finish, accuracy, and then legibility and lume. And you're going to see that this watch, I really pushed the limits, and we'll see at the end if this watch actually makes it and stays into the collection for even a little while. All right, let's go through size. The size of this watch is enormous. 46.5 millimeters across in diameter, 17.5 millimeters off the wrist. That's right, 17.5, almost 18. I just saw someone post a video on a G-Shock that was 18 millimeters. I'm like, oh my goodness, there's something even bigger than this out there. But 17.5 millimeters is a very tall watch off the wrist. And there's consequences for that, and we'll talk more about that when we get to fitment. But the overall size of this watch, it is what it is. The whole reason I purchased this watch was for that Gigantor look, and it certainly checks those boxes. Now, what about the size of the crown? I typically talk about the size of the crown or the pushers in this part of the video. And I think the size of the crown is good. It has a crown guard on there, so maybe just a little difficult to grab, but the texture on the crown I think is also good. The size of the pushers at the 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 8 o'clock. We'll talk about the 8 o'clock pusher here later on as well. I think those are all great, and they all have a great tactile response, so no issues with the size of those pushers. Now let's talk about the fitment, and this is where the wheels come off for this portion of the review. Because there's only 3 micro adjusts, the pin and collar system is extremely hard to manipulate and work just to get the right links removed so that I can do the micro adjusts. So those 2 things in combination just make this watch really difficult to size. As a matter of fact, I never could get it tight enough, because when you have a watch this heavy, this tall off the wrist, you need it close to the wrist. And I personally don't like a lot of slop of the watch on the wrist. So for me, this was just a very difficult watch to size, and I never did get it sized properly. Now, what about the finish of this watch? This is where this watch absolutely shines. I love the finish. I love the color coordination. The whole thing is really well done. You have a bezel that has a coin edge bezel, but it's also curved. Keep in mind, this is a curved crystal. It's a curved bezel. And I think it's kind of done for an engineering purpose, because you don't have as many corners when you have a tall watch like this on the wrist. You kind of back off on the protrusion of those corners as it relates to your wrist. So it has kind of a beveled look to the bezel and to the crystal, which I think is really cool, which is one of the reasons I went after this watch. I love the curved crystal idea, the curved bezel idea. The bezel is a nice deep blue color, and the 5-minute or 5-second markings, whatever you want to call it, on the bezel are great. The bezel doesn't move for obvious reasons, because it's just not designed to do that. I can't imagine a bezel like this actually moving. Plus, it's a curved bezel, just not going to happen. So the bezel itself, I really like it. Now let's look at the dial, because this is where all the action is, and frankly, this is where all the chaos is. This really is a chaotic dial. Now, when I looked at this online, when I was looking at the watch, I thought I picked out a watch color and design that was relatively easy to see. I knew I was going to suffer on the legibility side. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But as far as the overall design, the color scheme, I love the color scheme. You've got that deep blue bezel. You've got a nice gray-black combination in the dial, and you also have the orange second hand, and it's just a beautiful looking watch. I love the handsets in the subdials, and I love the subdials themselves. You've got all the subdials that I like with a chronograph, with one extra one, which is the 1/1000th of a second subdial. Really interesting subdial. It only activates at the end when you hit the stop button on the chronograph, so you're not going to see that dial move at all. It's just going to indicate where it is on the thousandth of a second. Now at the 12 o'clock position, you have the tenths and hundredths of a second. And for the first 30 seconds, you'll see here in the video, the first 30 seconds, that thing is spinning around like crazy. And once 30 seconds has elapsed, it stops at the 12 o'clock position and waits for you to hit the stop button on the chronograph. But if you hit stop in between 0 and 30 seconds, you're going to see that thing spin and then stop as you press the stop button or the 2 o'clock pusher. So at the 3 o'clock position, you have the 12-hour time totaler, and that gives you plenty of recorded time over a 12-hour period, which I absolutely love. I love a chronograph with a 12-hour time totaler. This is another area that I was really, I guess, attracted to by this watch. I thought this was a great fit for me. Also at the 9 o'clock position, you have the 60-minute time totaler. So those are the two that I would use the most, and it just does a great job. Now, that 8 o'clock pusher down at the bottom left, that is the formatting pusher. That tells you when you're in the time mode or you're in the chronograph mode. When you get the watch, it's in the time mode, and when you press that 8 o'clock pusher, wherever it is on the dial, it's going to rotate back to the 12 o'clock position and wait for you to use the start and stop pusher at the 2 o'clock position. So it's a great setup. I love it because one of the benefits that you get, and we're going to talk about the accuracy or the movement here in just a second, but one of the actions that you get with this is the smooth sweep, almost smooth sweep of the second hand while it's in the timekeeping mode. Some of these Precisionist movements, you get the second hand sweep that's really smooth, like on the lunar model, where the chronograph, when it's activated, sweeps, but the second hand, the running seconds, doesn't sweep. I like this model because it flips that around and it has the chronograph hand, what you would think is the chronograph hand, is the running seconds hand. And then when you want to use the chronograph, you press that button and it switches over to a chronograph hand. I think this is the best way. They should be doing this with all of their Precisionist movements. They need to do this with all their chronographs because I think this does a wonderful job of showcasing that high beat, ultra high beat movement with that ultra smooth second hand sweep. Now, some things I'm not real keen on with the dial. The date window kind of gets lost. It doesn't kind of. It gets lost in the dial. There's just so much going on. All the dials are there. It's a busy dial, and that's another thing. I knew that going in. But one of the things I wasn't prepared for was just how lost the hour hand and the minute hand would get in the dial. Now, on the photographs, when I was looking at it online, of course, you can see everything just plain as day. But when you have it on in real time, outdoors, indoors, and you're going to see some video of that, it just, the second hand and or the hour hand and the minute hand just get lost in the dial more so than I ever thought, even in low light conditions. And here's a baffling thing that they did. They put white paint on the what I would consider the counterbalance side of the hour hand and the minute hand, so that when you're looking at this, there's a split second where it's like, which end am I looking at? And you have to try to figure out if the white tip on the hour hand is actually the white tip on the hour hand, or if that's the counterbalance side, the opposite side. So for me, that just didn't really fit well for me. That's a legibility issue, but it's also a finish issue. I wish they hadn't put the white paint on the opposite end of the hour hand or the minute hand. The curved crystal is a mineral crystal, so yeah, it's going to get scratched on certain surfaces more so than a sapphire crystal will. But at the same time, that's kind of just what you're getting here. You can't have all of these things. Now, moving to the outside where the case and the bracelet are, I love the finish on the case and the bracelet. It's this gray ion plated color, and I love that color scheme. You've got some polish and you've got some brush, just enough flash on the bracelet where it's not too flashy. At the same time, it gets a little bit of the, eye attention on the bracelet itself. But then the case itself and the coloration on the bezel, the whole thing just matches up really well. I love the design and I love the execution of the case and the bracelet. Now the clasp, we're going to spend a little time on the clasp. It has a fold over double pusher clasp, high polish, but the problem is it has 3 micro adjusts. If it had 4 or 5, this watch would probably fit way better on the wrist. You could get it as snug as you needed to, maybe just a little bit more snug than you want because it is such a top heavy watch. But the clasp is made of stamped steel. It's not milled. So yeah, you're making a concession on that as well. Let's talk about the accuracy of the movement. The accuracy is that 262 kilohertz movement. This is famous for being ultra accurate. Typically you're talking seconds, like single-digit seconds within a month. And so this watch is one of those watches where you only lose or gain seconds in a year, and that is typical for it. Now, I think the specs on this are a little bit higher than that, but that's the experience I have with the Precisionist movement. It is a great movement, and you get that ultra smooth, almost ultra perfectly smooth sweep of the second hand. Now, what about legibility and lume? We've talked about legibility a little bit. The legibility in this watch is really not good at all. There's just too much stuff going on, and this hour hand and the minute hand being skeletonized and having not a lot of contrasting color with the contrast of the background just isn't very good. So the legibility of this watch is very low. Now, what about the lume in this watch? It's terrible. And this was kind of the nail in the coffin. As you can tell, these things are starting to stack up. That also suffers on the legibility side. When you're looking at the hour markers, which is not too hard to find because the contrast is pretty good and it's outside of all of the busyness. But those hour markers, those indices could have been a lot larger. There's a lot of text on this dial as well. You've got the tachymeter and the bezel. You've also got all the writing and all the stuff that's on the inside with those subdials. So the legibility and the lume on this watch is really about as bad as I've seen on a watch. Now, upside, you have 300 meters of water resistance, you have a mineral crystal, you have a great stainless steel case and bracelet, but you've got a lot of high polished things on there, especially on the clasp. So is this a work watch? Not in the labor sense of work watch, maybe an office job or maybe something working from home where you're not doing a lot of banging around with tools and equipment. But it's also not a professional watch. I don't see this fitting underneath any kind of a cuff. This is more of a statement watch. You're going to wear this out in the town, something that you want to make a statement in front of everybody else when you're wearing this watch, and it's going to happen. It's a great watch for that, no doubt about it. Now, what are some of the downsides to this? Well, the clasp, the fitment, the way that the pin and collars just are really difficult to change out the lugs. It just is a very difficult watch to get the size right. And because it's such a top-heavy watch, you really need to get the size right. Also, the lume and the legibility just isn't going to cut it over the long haul. This isn't really working out for me. On the upside, yeah, the design is great. It's huge. The finishing, I love the color scheme and the finishing on the case and on the bracelet. I love all that stuff, but it just doesn't hit the mark for me. So the ultimate score on this, 9.0 out of 10. Is it a recommend? If you want to make a statement, yes. Otherwise, I can't recommend it. So if you want a statement watch, this would be a great watch for you. But overall, this watch just does not have the overall package when it comes down to some of the functional things that really make the watch a good watch for time telling and just some of the basic needs that you might have even out of a chronograph. So there you go. Put your comments down below on this watch, the Bulova 96B 343. Kind of a recommendation, although I'm not going to hang on to this watch. It's actually going to be sent back. So check out my webpage, realidealgear.com, for other watches that have been reviewed that you can get a great deal on. My name is Tim. This has been another Real Ideal Gear review. We'll catch you guys next time.